Hi, this is part 2 of the Survey Voting Committee workshop. In part 1, I gave some background, some definition of terms, and some just material that is currently in our Constitution that talks about consensus decision making. And I'm getting ready now to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of what our survey voting committee does so that we can actually do what our Constitution says, and that is use consensus decision making. But before I even go there, I do have to talk about something that happened a few years ago at one of our other annual retreats when we were in I think a board meeting and trying to make some decisions. It kind of dawned on us that it is in our Constitution that we say we want to use consensus decision making and circular decision making, but it's one thing to have it on paper and quite another thing to implement it, because when you use a term like consensus decision making, it can mean many different things. So after that annual meeting a few years ago, there was a group of us that got together to research what different groups in different ways consensus decision making has been used, maybe different models. And after we researched this, we came up with what's titled the Consensus Team Report. And in that report, we outline what we thought would work as a good model for ARCWP when we did consensus decision making as a group. So at that time, this was after the work was done in the committee of the research and putting together a model that we thought would work. We sent it out to our group, and this was in October of 2014. At that time, we were about 51 members. We asked the membership to look at the report and decide if they approved using that model for consensus decision making. And so we, fortunately, all 51 people responded, and all 51 people approved that model. So it was 100% approval of this consensus team report or model for consensus decision making. So I want to look at a few points to that. I'm going to send the whole report on an attachment, but this will help us see what's happening now in the Survey Voting Committee and kind of the background or the model that we are leaning on as we proceed with decision making in the Survey Voting Committee. So I'm going to read to you the beginning of the report, to the first two statements, the title and the first two statements. So it's the Consensus Team Report, and it says, seeking consensus, two major concerns of the consensus team were, number one, that there be ample time allotted for each community member to pray, discern, and discuss thoroughly any major issue that would require consensus. And number two, that each member's voice would be heard equally and that her and his opinion would be treated with respect and noted, regardless if it were contrary to the majority of the community's voices. Then there's a middle section of the report that I'm not going to read right now, and actually I'll just say it's a little bit idealistic about things that we hope that would happen before each annual meeting. This may need a tweaking or adjusting, but it was kind of where we were at the time when we were doing this. So, but but really, another key part to this report that you will see now when you get a survey, you will see some of this exact language, and this is where it came from. And so, if we're going to do consensus decision making, the report says our final goal is that we can get to this outcome after we've discussed and made a decision together. So I'm going to read the conclusion, which says, "It is our goal that all community members will be able to agree with the following statements after decisions have been reached. I believe the group understands my point of view. I appreciate the various points of view in the group. This might not have been my first choice, but I can live with it. And I will support this decision in an open and fair manner." So if you can just imagine, if we want to be every person in our group to be able to say these statements after we've made a decision, there's a very important piece of the work that we must do to get to that point. And I almost was going to bring some posters to put all around the room during our workshop, but I didn't do it. But just imagine a room with the words around you, all around on every single wall, that say conversation and discussion. Because discussion and conversation are a huge element needed if we're going to be able to make a decision together that ends with those four statements coming out, honestly coming from each member. So, when we have topics that we want to discuss and make decisions around, we cannot bypass the discussion stage of decision making. And so that is why we in the survey voting committee have, in the last, probably since the beginning of this year, been working very hard to give opportunities to the whole membership to discuss important topics that we just need to discuss that will probably lead to consensus decision making around those topics, or it might lead to tweaking the Constitution, adding a policy. Different kinds of things will happen as we have these very important discussions. So I'm going to now just talk about what we have figured out as our process for processing a topic. When this committee first started, we had a very long list of topics that T had vetted from all the emails that were out there at that time. And she worked really hard in pulling out of all of the discussions a long list of things that seemed like people wanted to talk more about and maybe even make some decisions around. So that list was compiled by our committee, and it was sent to you in a survey, and we asked you to prioritize what were your top 5 topics that you wanted to start with as we began discussing them, so that we could process the topic in a way that would lead to whatever we needed to do with the discussion, whether we needed to have another survey and have a vote on a topic, or if we needed to send it to a committee like the Constitution Committee. So we we narrowed it down to, with your help, with the whole community's help, of prioritizing what were the top 5 topics that we were going to start with. And this was just sort of like a beginning place, and actually to come up with what the process looked like when we discussed a topic, and B, to begin the important work of dealing with all the issues and topics that were coming at us way faster than we could process. And even in the midst of discussing the top 5 topics, we were interrupted with more pertinent topics that just kind of came up in the midst of our work. And so we allowed other topics to come in because they had a very definite end point, which was soon, such as sending Janice and Christina to the WOW conference. That came in the midst of our top 5 topics, so we allowed for that to happen because a decision needed to be made quickly. So now I'm going to stop again. This is the end of part 2, and I hope you'll stay tuned and continue to part 3, where I will specifically tell you an outline of what process we came up with as a committee and have been using, and want you to be aware of why and how that evolved, and what we're doing with it. So thank you for being with me on part 2, and please follow me into part 3.